Hi, it's time for another verb of the day. Today's verb is rebel. Let's take a look at some of the definitions or the ways that we use this verb. The first way you might hear rebel used is to mean to create armed resistance to an established government or leader. Sometimes, as you read historical events, about historical events, or even modern day ones, you're going to see this verb used to describe usually when a group of people have some type of armed resistance. So think weapons, and they're using it in order to defeat a government, a ruler, a leader, something of that nature. Now, a second way you'll hear rebel used is to mean to resist authority, control, or convention. So the second definition doesn't have kind of that physical violence that's associated with the first definition. But this one, again, might be reflected in our words and our behavior, kind of this idea that we're fighting someone or some group that has control or authority over us. A third way you'll hear rebel used is to mean to show or feel resistance to something. Now, sometimes that could be perhaps like part of our body that it feels like it's resisting a particular movement or something we're trying to do. I've got an example sentence a little later that will connect to this third definition. You should know that the verb rebel is a regular verb. And I want to note, as I'm pronouncing this word, I'm putting the stress on the second syllable. That's going to be important for a couple reasons. The first is connected to how we add suffixes to form other verb tenses. So to make the progressive form of my verb, rebelling, I need to double the L, and that's because I have a verb that ends with a consonant vowel consonant, and that stress is on the second syllable. So you're going to see the double L, and then you're going to see the ing to form rebelling. The past tense and participle forms of this verb can be made by adding ed. Again, before I add that suffix, I need to double the ending consonant, the L here. And when I form this past tense uh, word, rebelled, you might hear I'm making a D sound as I say it. That's because our base verb, rebel, ends in a voiced L sound. This means when I add the ed suffix, I'm not adding an extra syllable, I'm just creating this sound. Okay? And that's all because L is a voiced sound. Now, let's spend just a quick moment looking at a phrasal verb that you are likely to encounter, that is to rebel against. This ties back to those earlier definitions we were looking at. So this could be to resist or revolt against someone or something. Let's look at an example sentence here. The franchisees rebelled against 7-Eleven by closing for a few hours each day. I borrowed this sentence from a news story. So this is a real event. The parent company, 7-Eleven, tells their franchisees, those who operate a single store or maybe a handful of stores with that particular name, they tell them they need to be open 24 hours a day. Right? But a small group resisted this. They decided they were going to fight for a number of reasons about this. Okay? So that's how it connects to that particular meaning. Now, let's continue using our verb of the day, rebel, in a couple different verb tenses. The first we'll discuss today is the past progressive. Your teacher or your textbooks might call this the past continuous, and that's just fine. It means exactly the same thing, continuous, progressive. And the idea here is we are describing an action that was ongoing, something that was progressing or continuing in the past. Many times when we use the past progressive, you will see two verbs. So you'll see one in the past progressive, noting that some action was continuing, and then you're going to see a second verb in the simple past tense, and that is many times thought as the interrupting action. So the action that occurred while the first action was occurring. Now, some people might say, why do you call this the past progressive, or why do you use that name? And it's because I like to help my students remember past progressive, two P's. I need two parts to form my verb here in the affirmative. So I'm going to use the past form of be, and our forms of be change based on what the subject is. So if my subject is I, he, she, or it, I'm going to use was. And if my subject is you, we, or they, I'm going to use were. Okay? So my first part of my verb here is the past tense form of be, and then I use the ing form of the verb. Let's take a look at some example sentences. My first affirmative example here is Cuba and the Philippines were rebelling against Spain in the late 1800s. So here we're talking about the people who inhabited these now present day countries fighting back against Spain, who claimed ownership or claimed rule of these particular places. So these two countries are very far apart, but these actions were occurring at the same point in the past. Now, if I want to make a negative past progressive sentence, what I'm going to do is have my subject, then I'll choose between was or were, whichever form matches that subject. I'll use not, and then the ing form of the verb. You might hear some speakers use wasn't and then the ing form, or weren't and then the ing form. They mean exactly the same thing. In fact, I've used the contraction in my example sentences. He wasn't rebelling when he missed curfew. His car broke down. So here, a particular maybe teenager being late to arriving home at a particular hour, it wasn't because they were kind of like, I'm going to show my parents who's in charge. I'm resisting their authority. There was an accident, right? There was a problem. His car wasn't working. Now let's look at making a yes or no question in the past progressive. To do this, I start with was or were, whichever form matches my subject. That subject comes next. And then you're going to see the ing form of the verb. Here's another example. Were they rebelling against the government? Right? So here we would be going back to that first definition, talking about fighting against a government, a leader. Now let's talk about the simple future. Today we're going to make some sentences using will. Will is very common when people are making predictions, guesses about what they think will happen in the future. You'll hear it with offers and promises, quick decisions. You might also hear it with plans. The nice thing about the simple future is that our structure is going to stay the same no matter what our subject is. So I'll have my subject, I'll use will, and then I'm going to use the base verb. You can see an example on the screen. Citizens will rebel if this becomes law. Okay? So sometimes I've heard elected officials say things like this many times when they're trying to convince another party not to pass a particular law. And many times this is an overreaction, but it's meant to catch people's or get people's attention. Now let's talk about making negative simple future sentences. To do this, I start with my subject, I use will not, and then the base verb. You might hear the contraction won't, W-O-N apostrophe T. That's very common in spoken English. I've actually used it in my example. My children won't rebel against me. Many parents say this quite confidently when their children are quite young. That idea, they're not going to do something just to fight authority. So, for some people, it might be what they do with their hair, could be piercings, other things, maybe dangerous behavior in some cases. But again, that idea, they're fighting the rules, fighting who's in charge. Lastly, let's look at making a yes or no question in the simple future. To do this, I start with will, then I'm going to have my subject and then the base verb. Let's look at the last example. Will her legs rebel during the final few miles of the marathon? So here's that connection to the third definition, right? Where something is resisting us. So this is a question about someone who's running a long distance, 26.2 miles, and someone might be asking for a prediction. What's going to happen in those last few miles? Are her legs going to feel okay, or is it going to feel like she's fighting them, or that they are resisting her as she attempts to finish this race? Now, let's spend a moment looking at some words that are related to our verb rebel. The first word we're going to look at is the noun form of this word. You're going to notice the same pronunciation, but sorry, the same spelling. You're going to notice the same spelling, but there's a different pronunciation. That's the important thing to remember here. So, when I use this word as a noun, my stress, where I say the word a little louder and longer, it's going to shift to the first syllable. So the noun is pronounced rebel, rebel, not rebel, rebel. I hope you can hear that small difference there. So when I use this word as a noun, many times I'm using it to describe a person who is fighting, who is in opposition against a government or some other leader. An example of this might be rebels stormed the palace. So here I associate palace with maybe a king, a queen. And so again, we've got people joining together to kind of fight that particular ruler or leader. A second way you hear the noun rebel used is to just refer to any person who resists authority or control. An example of this. Many teens like to think of themselves as rebels. This idea of like I'm fighting back. I'm not being told what to do. Let's talk about a couple more related words. The next is the noun rebellion. This word can be used to describe an act of violent resistance. And generally, it's describing that resistance against some government or some leader. An example of this might be Shays' rebellion occurred in 1786 and 1787 as citizens responded to the government's efforts to collect taxes. Now, when I thought of this noun, that's where my mind went to this particular thing. I kind of remembered it from history classes. I don't remember a lot of details, but it's this idea of groups of people fighting, in this case, a government who was trying to collect taxes. I believe this occurred in Western Massachusetts, as you can see, a very long time ago. Now, a second way you'll hear rebellion used is just to refer to kind of any general action where a person or group of people are resisting authority or resisting some type of control. Here's another example. The London Marathon could be interrupted by an environmental rebellion. As I looked for some modern day references to or uses of this word, this was a story that kept popping up as I searched. So there's been lots of discussion in the next few days when the London Marathon is being held, if there are going to be different forms of protest related to environmental policies. And so this word rebellion was being used many times to make a prediction about what might occur this weekend. The last related word we'll discuss today is the adjective rebellious. This means that someone is showing some desire to resist authority or control. An example of this might be their music has a rebellious spirit. So when I thought about this, my mind immediately went to the band Nirvana, which was very popular when I was a child, and many saw them as trying to resist authority, resist control, resist what many people in the music industry were telling them to do, how to produce, or what to sound like, or what would be successful on the radio. Based on my age, that's where mine goes. My mind goes. Yours might go to a different form of music. Another way to use the adjective rebellious is to refer to something that just isn't very easily kept in place. So, might say, if I have hair that's being kind of wild today, my hair is being rebellious. Thank you so much for watching today's video. I hope you have a great day.